Okay. Thanks for coming to the Lunch and Learn. It's on floodplain management and permitting specifically. I'm the floodplain manager, Amelia Schoen, Planning and Development Director. Bryce, take us away. Okay, so floodplain, I just thought I'd start off broadly with what a floodplain is and what flooding is. So flooding is a natural process, not a bad thing. Marcus says I'm kind of quiet. How about now, Marcus? Better. Okay, so floodplains and flooding, it's a natural process. They're important. They filter nutrients when rivers flood. They provide groundwater recharge. So when rivers go out of their banks, the water gets absorbed into the ground through infiltration. They provide habitat, nesting and breeding grounds. And so when is flooding a problem then? Well, it's when we have human development, which, as you can see from this slide, when we add fill to the floodplain, increases flood levels, and also causes property damage. I know this is about wetlands, but it applies to floods too. So you can see, we've got the natural function in the first three pictures, where the river expands after it rains. And then when we straighten and build near rivers, they flood more. And then we've also got this human element involved, and that's when flooding becomes a problem. And these are just some images. I got to credit Leanne. She's been the floodplain manager for a number of years and sent me all her presentations, including these great images. And so a lot of this is taken from Leanne's previous presentations, but what you see here is the result of a flood. So in the lower image, that's actually flooding in Ames, just outside of Ames, across Interstate 35. So flooding causes not only property damage, but infrastructure damage. And why does damage occur? So flood forces are the main reason why. Starting on the right, you can see debris impacts. So this isn't, an example of something like a car floating down during a flood and hitting the side of a house. It's wood debris getting built up behind a fence, which is something we do require a permit for this very reason, because that debris piles up and creates dams and backs up water and can cause more damage to structures, even if it's not hitting a structure. There's also flood forces on the side of a structure as floodwaters move. There's hydrostatic forces, so just the built up weight of floodwaters on foundation. Even if the floodwaters aren't moving quickly, that's a lot of pressure on your foundation. And then there's buoyancy forces too. So that's when the ground is saturated, that water pushes up on the bottom of structures and can cause issues in basements especially. So what is floodplain management? It's regulations to reduce these flood damages and protect the natural functions of our floodplains. And Story County's adopted floodplain management standards are in Chapter 80 of our Code of Ordinances. This is a separate chapter from our zoning code. It's a standalone chapter, and it's where we have all of our development standards for when you're building in a floodplain and when you're not allowed to build in a floodplain, which is what we'll get into here in a minute. So a little bit more about why we have floodplain management. Of course, there's definitely damages from flooding, and we need to maintain those natural functions. But we also have something called the National Flood Insurance Program, which was created in 1968. This was in response to costly federal government damage payments to communities and individuals after flood disasters. They created a flood insurance program, which created federally backed flood insurance that folks in floodplains and floodplains can both purchase. It's, going to be a lower rate than you'd get on the private market for insurance. And in exchange for participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, or in order to participate in that, so our community members can get this, federally backed flood insurance, we've got to adopt certain floodplain management standards. So again, flood insurance program is an alternative to disaster assistance from the federal government. 73, because not a lot of communities were joining, it actually became a requirement for flood insurance if you were building in a floodplain and you had a federally backed loan or mortgage, which most folks do. And just a note here, again, you don't have to be in a floodplain to buy this flood insurance, because we're in a community that participates. Even outside of floodplains, you can get flood insurance, which is important. For instance, if your storm drain fills up on your street and you and another property flood just from that, urban stormwater runoff, you can still submit a flood insurance claim. And so 25% of flood insurance claims are for damages in areas outside of mapped floodplains. So we're participating in the NFIP. We're participating by enforcing these regulations. I've heard some of our flood regulations are pretty strict. And I just wanted to point out on this slide, we have to enforce our ordinance or there's serious ramifications. Folks would lose their flood insurance. There would be no federal aid for buildings in floodplains at max. So we'd be suspended from the NFIP, and all the folks in our community that have flood insurance would no longer have that insurance, which would be a problem because these are the folks in our floodplains. So the NFIP has three parts. There's mapping, which helps communities determine where floodplains are. It provides the insurance that we've already talked about. And then it also asks that we adopt minimum standards for floodplain management. So we're going to talk about the mapping first. So the FEMA does a flood insurance study for each community, in this case, the county and its cities. That flood insurance study does hydraulic, hydrologic studies of our rivers and streams and other water bodies to determine where the 100-year floodplain is. So that we're all in a floodplain, right? Every part of the county, but the 100-year floodplain is where you've got the risk of having there's a 1% annual chance of having a flood. So you could be in the 1,000-year floodplain. That's not going to be mapped in our flood insurance study, but just so we all know that we're all in a floodplain, it just depends on what level of risk you're at for flooding annually, if you're mapped or not. So the 1% annual chance flood is a 26% chance of actually flooding during the life of a typical mortgage. We often call this the base flood, and you'll hear me use the word base flood elevation today a lot. And that's the elevation at which we can expect floodwaters to get to during a flood event. We're also going to be calling this the special flood hazard area. So the special flood hazard area, the 100-year flood, this is just an example of how it would be mapped in one of those flood insurance studies prepared by FEMA that then the county adopts. This is the area where we have to enforce floodplain regulations to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And it's the area where it's mandatory to purchase insurance if you have a federally backed loan or mortgage for your property. You can find this map on Beacon as well, so you don't have to go into our flood insurance study. You can go into Beacon, type in your address or your parcel ID, and click on the floodway FEMA flood hazard zone layer and see if you're in a floodplain. It'll pop up in a shade of blue if you are. And if you've got questions, we've got our contact info at the end of this presentation. So now let's talk about our regulations. Why are we reviewing proposed development in the floodplain? First off, I know we've talked about a lot of these again, but decreasing loss of life and property in these flood areas, restoring and protecting our natural resources and natural functions of floodplain. We're decreasing taxpayer-funded disaster costs. With our regulations, we're actually decreasing the costs of floodplain insurance for property owners in Story County. We're also avoiding liability and lawsuits from damages and failures to enforce a floodplain ordinance. So my second bullet point on this slide is you need a permit for any development in the floodplain. Again, those mapped areas. And by development, I mean any man-made change to the ground, not just structures, grading, fences. If you're adding riprap to a stream, you need a permit. Even the county itself needs permits for its work to do bridge and culvert replacements and maintenance, and to install even just saturated buffers in fields. Agricultural practices also need a permit. We recently had an individual come in who's a farmer, and he's just adding some fill to an edge of a grassed waterway to prevent crop damages. It's a very small area of fill, about 20 feet, and he needs a permit. And again, we do that because when we add fill and other structures to the floodplain, it has downstream impacts. Okay, so the first standard that we have is for elevation. And so this is the most common, I'd say, floodplain or understood floodplain standard. So when you develop in a floodplain, you have the base flood elevation, and you have to build at a level above that to be outside of the floodwaters. So in Story County, we require that you build at 3 feet above that base flood elevation, which is a number that's included on the flood insurance study, or something that we in our department can work with the DNR to help you determine. At the base flood elevation, you'd be looking at a pretty high insurance premium. So again, part of this regulation, the reason we have these regulations is to decrease insurance premiums. So at 3 feet above base flood insurance elevation, you're looking at saving thousands of dollars a year on your flood insurance when you're building in these floodplains. The most common type of elevation, and in fact, the only elevation for residential structures we allow in Story County, is elevating on fill. So dirt installed in layers and at a certain level of compaction, which we have a soils professional certified, has to be sloped appropriately so that we're not having erosion. I will also say that elevating on fill is a good option for homeowners, because a lot of the time, if you've built up your property on fill 3 feet above the floodplain, extending 18 feet out, as our ordinance requires, you can then submit to FEMA to be removed from the mapped floodplain, because you're at an elevation that protects you enough. Besides that, we require fill as opposed to piers or other types of elevation, because we want you to be able to leave your property in the event of a flood, right, safely. We're going to require that your driveway is elevated, and if the county road that you're taking access from is under the flood level, your property is probably not buildable for a house, because we want you to be safe, and we don't want to put our first responders at risk who need to come evacuate you in the event of a flood. I mean, these regulations are set up for safety, number one, of our citizens. So these are other types of elevations that we don't allow. You need a variance, but I'm showing them because certain structures would be allowed to be elevated in this way: commercial structures or accessory structures. Some accessory structures, if they're under 600 square feet, can be allowed to essentially flood if they're low damage potential. So it depends what's in them, and along with the size, but we do require that they would be stabilized and not anchored, not float away during the flood. And also, as we talked about, those hydrostatic forces, you know, just the force of floodwaters just by standing against walls, we would require vents in those structures to allow floodwaters to pass through, to dissipate some of those forces, to ensure that that structure isn't too badly damaged by the flood. Back to elevation, we make sure that your property is adequately elevated to our 3-foot standard through an elevation certificate, which a surveyor prepares. What we do is we'll get your plans in, we'll see what elevation you're at, you submit a pre-construction elevation certificate to us. During construction, we'll come out, and your surveyor will as well, and complete a certificate during construction. So before you start building, we make sure you're at the right elevation so you don't get done and I come out and say, wow, you're only 2 feet. Lift up your house and add another foot of fill. And then at the end, we'll have a final grade. We look at the levels of the floor and the fill as well, and do another elevation certificate. And you can submit this to your insurance to show what elevation you're at and get a better rate on your insurance as well. For non-residential structures, we also allow something called dry flood proofing, and it's where an engineer designs your building. If you could go back to that slide before, so that if there's a flood up to 3 feet above the base flood elevation, you know, the building's going to stay dry. So in this case, you can see there's you know, some concrete around the foundation that would prevent floodwaters. And there's this dark object on the right side of the screen. It is a piece of metal that you basically slide in the door to prevent floodwaters from entering around the door. I know there is a term for it and I am blanking, so I apologize, Leanne. Flood barrier, thank you. Okay. It sounds better than what I said, the piece of metal. So with flood proofing, again, there is another certificate. This is again, so that we can make sure your building's safe from flooding, that it's meeting our standards, and you can submit it to your insurance. Other requirements related to flood proofing, beyond the walls being watertight, we have to make sure your utilities are elevated, electric, above that flood level. We also have to make sure that you're being designed to resist those loads, the floodwater loads again. And we would discourage you from using floodproofing measures that require human intervention. So that flood barrier we saw, because you might not be at your building when it floods, or they could fail. You know, if you've got something automatic that relies on electricity in a flood event and the electricity's out, you're not going to get your barrier in place in time. Other standards, and I have a video here because one of our standards is, again, making sure utilities are elevated, but that includes propane tanks, right? Making sure your propane tank is elevated and anchored so that it doesn't do this. And other standards include as well for septic systems. We have to make sure your septic system still functions during a flood event, and there isn't going to be flood water or forces that cause scour that will dislodge your tank and the cover, causing seepage into floodwaters, as well as costly repairs being needed. Your well, for similar reasons, will need to be elevated so that floodwaters can't enter your well and contaminate your water. We also have limitations on the amount of an area of a lot that can be filled in, again, to provide for those natural floodplain functions and make sure we're not increasing flood levels downstream. And we talked about fences, but fences in floodplains have to be breakaway. So what that means is you have a T-post in the ground. There's no concrete or anything around it. So it's designed, to keep your cattle in when it's not flooding. But when it does flood, fall over so that debris doesn't build up behind the fence, cause a damming effect and other damages. We also, for all dwellings that are being built even near floodplains, we look at the elevation of those versus the base flood elevation to make sure that those are reasonably safe. Because even if you're outside of a mapped floodplain and you're putting a basement in and you're below the base flood elevation with that basement, you're likely going to get some flood forces, buoyancy, if not other issues. One concept I wanted to touch on related to our regulations is this idea of a floodway. And basically what it means is there's higher standards for development in this area, because this is the area where any development will cause a foot of rise to happen downstream. FEMA runs a simulation adding fill to a floodplain until the point at which 1 foot of rise is created, and that is the floodway. And in the floodway, we do not allow any development that creates a rise, because again, this is about, downstream property owners. Your house might be one of them, right? We don't want to allow any obstructions in this channel because this is also the area where there's going to be the highest velocities of flood flows. And on the no rise, we do require an engineer to submit a certificate when you are grading or doing other work in that area to show that there's no rise. So how do you know if you're in the floodway, and how do you know what your base flood elevation is? The top image, you can see there's 2 shades of blue. The light blue is one where FEMA, through the flood insurance study, has already determined where that floodway is, as well as the flood elevations. So that's a pretty easy determination we can make. The dark blue area is where FEMA didn't do that additional study. That could be for a variety of reasons. I think in unincorporated Story County, the main one is a lot of folks don't live downstream of that floodplain. So FEMA focused on areas inside cities or upstream of cities to make these determinations. So when we're reviewing permits and you're in this dark blue area where we know within the 100-year flood, but we don't know what level that gets to, and we don't know where that floodway is, we submit a request to the DNR through their online permit tool, and they can help us with that technical assistance to determine those levels. It does take a while, so if you're planning on submitting a floodplain permit, plan on a month and a half at least. The other thing the DNR does, and not just the DNR, the Corps of Engineers, we're required under the NFIP to make sure all federal and state standards for floodplain management are also met. They also have their own standards. The Corps has Waters of the US. The DNR has its own floodplain management standards. So we require that you submit your application through this same portal called Permit to them, and we hold your permit until we hear back from them that you're good with their standards as well. The final concept I wanted to talk about, floodplain management and these regulations don't just apply to new structures. It's additions, it's existing structures. If you don't meet our current standards and you're doing an addition, or you don't meet our current standards and you're damaged in a flood event or otherwise, when you build, there's these concepts of substantial damage and substantial improvement, and over a certain threshold, we do require you to come into conformance with our current elevation or other standards. This is just a slide on our permit process. So after you make an application, we review it for compliance. We'll issue it. I do an inspection before I issue it, just to get an idea of what ground levels look like. We do another inspection when you're done, determine compliance through certificates and otherwise, and then we'll issue you, some folks would refer to this as a certificate of occupancy or a final permit in our case. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the community rating system. So this is something that in 2016, I think, Leanne, you worked on getting the county to become a part of. It is a voluntary program for everyone that participates in the NFIP. Not all communities do it, but when we have higher standards like that 3-foot elevation requirement, technically under participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, structures just have to be built at or above flood levels. They don't have to have that extra elevation. But when communities have higher standards, we can effectively be rewarded for that, not us, but our citizens. And so right now, because of Story County's higher standards and the community rating system program, Story County gets a 15% discount. Residents get a 15% discount on their flood insurance policies. We can go up to a 45% discount. So we're always working on new programs to get more points in the community rating system. With that, I can take any questions. FEMA. Yeah.
Okay.
The question was, how often is a flood study done by FEMA? We had one in 2000. We had one in 2008. Then one in 2013 or 2015. And then we had another one in 2021. And those flood studies do take some time. I think we got the draft maps from FEMA maybe in 2018 before they were in, it took 4 years to adopt them. Maybe it was 2019. So there's some review. I'm looking at Leanne to correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. So every number of years, and it's just based on, I think the last time we did an update, the DNR had better data. And so they wanted to update our flood maps because they've got better information on the topography. So they wanted them to be more accurate.
And where are those available? Are they available on FEMA's website?
Yeah. So I've got paper copies downstairs, but they're on FEMA's website and they're on Beacon. So if you're looking up your property, you can turn on the flood layer and see if you're in a floodplain, and those are our current adopted maps available. Mm-hmm. Sean, do you have a question? No. So Sean's question was, how frequently do people build in the floodplain? In Story County, not a lot. There's a lot of permits though for, grading work related to agricultural uses, folks putting up fences for cattle. That is a common use. We don't get a lot of houses in though. I think that part of it could be our outreach and education on floodplains, but we have really large parcels, right? In Story County, we have typically 98% of the county requires 35-acre minimum lot size. So most folks have options to build outside of a floodplain, and we try to encourage them when they come into our office to site their house appropriately. Mm-hmm. The question was, what percentage of our floodplain is in public lands? I don't, but probably not a lot, since there's only 3% of land statewide is public. We are, okay. Do you know, Leanne? Yeah, we can look into that. Okay. Leanne thinks she has it and we can look it up. But I think the most significant portion that's in public lands would be along the Skunk River. Yep. So there's some areas owned by the, and of course, county conservation parks in that area, the Skunk River Greenbelt. So that's public and floodplain.
We would also have I think, I haven't looked since the last mapping, but the Coola Bogs area and the area down by Collins. What's that
Yeah.
called?
The DNR owned
Yeah.
Larson Marsh? Hendrickson Marsh?
The Hendrickson.
Yeah.
Sweet. And then there's areas up in Lafayette Township too. But with this last iteration of maps, the floodplain was compressed. So I think that my original percentages will be off because of the reduction in the size of the floodplain.
So yeah, again, when we got our maps updated, they had better data and those floodplains were reduced. And I think that's a good question in regards to the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains too. There's a reason that those are public lands, right? They provide not just recreation, but important habitat. There's a lot of wetland areas adjacent to floodplains. So the question is, what's the process for if you'd like floodplain to be removed from your property? It depends on two things. For individual property owners mainly, again, if you've elevated on fill, you can apply for a letter of map revision based on that fill using the elevation certificate that you worked on with our department to FEMA to have that removed. You'd be set for that, really. It goes to FEMA, but we'd help you review that application and have it. There's a community sign-off component where we say, yes, this property was built on fill above the flood level, 3 feet. There are also processes if you believe that the mapping is incorrect. So let's say with the latest maps that came out, there was a house that was mapped in the floodplain, but it was 20 feet above the river channel, right? And so that's just based on natural topography. We were able, again, because they initially built in a floodplain, we had the elevation of that house and we were able to provide it in that application to FEMA that the property owner submits. Did I touch on it enough, Leanne? Thank you. I just want to give a shout out to Leanne for training me in floodplain management and the community rating system. She's just a great resource and really a big part of why we have such a strong floodplain management program in Story County.
I appreciate that, but we also need to give shout out to Les Beck, who was my predecessor when I was down in planning and development. And then also Natalie Harrington, who used to be a code enforcement officer for Story County. She and I put a lot of time together on CFM studying and she built a lot of the aspects of the program. So it's a long, solid history, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And Andrea's been taking training too. She's a planner at our department, hoping to become a CFM as well.
Question.
Yeah.
Can the Board of Supervisors approve changes to the floodplain map?
Yeah, well, no. I thought you were going to say ordinance. So the Board of Supervisors is the approval authority of our standards for floodplain development. So when we adopted a 3-foot elevation standard from a 1.5-foot elevation standard, that took board action and approval. The board approves effectively our participation in the National Flood Insurance Program, and it has to adopt our floodplain maps. But no, the board cannot change the maps because that's a technical process that requires someone to review flood elevations, survey data, even hydraulic studies. And so that's why FEMA is charged with those actual map amendments. Thanks, Bryce. If that's it, I should have planned more time.
I do want to say this was a very nice session, and because this is such a technical area, hopefully this will be one of those recurring features.
Great. Yeah, I hope to put this on our website. Yeah. Yes. And another great resource that we'll post as well on the website, and I think it's already there, but the DNR has a video series called Flooding in Iowa. If folks want to learn more, it's very digestible. There's short videos on different topics. Okay, thanks, everybody.